Hello, and welcome to this video looking at dealing with VAT in Sage Intacct. To process your VAT, you'll need to make use of the taxes application within the program. Using this allows you to comply with the requirements set out by HMRC and submit your VAT return via the Making Tax Digital Gateway. This video will take you through an overview of the setup and configuration of the taxes application. So where do we start? Well, we first need to make sure that our users have the relevant permissions to be able to perform their tasks. To be able to configure the tax solutions for your business, users need to be granted access to all options within the tax solutions permission. If your users are going to be preparing and submitting the VAT return, then they need to have access to all of the options within the tax submissions permission. The last permission you can see on screen allows the users access to the tax records lists. It also gives them access to view the records. Now we've set our access, there are a few things that we need to check in the program before we complete the setup. Many of these steps will most likely be performed by an administrator or implementer, and unless specifically called out, they must all be carried out at the top level if you're dealing with a multi-entity organisation. The language determines the terminology that is displayed. As we are dealing with a UK VAT return, we need to make sure that we have the correct language set. To do this, navigate to Company, Setup, and then Company. In the Global Settings section, select the desired language. When dealing with the taxes application, the only accounting method supported is accrual only. Make sure that this is selected before we continue. We need to make sure that we enter the correct VAT number that is registered with the HMRC. We also need to make sure that the company name displays correctly. Create at least one general ledger account to capture VAT when transactions are posted to the general ledger. Typically, a liability account will be used for this. While you can use the same general ledger account for both input and output VAT, best practice would be to record input and output VAT using separate general ledger accounts to see a clearer picture of the totals for both. When your company was provisioned, the taxes application was added to the subscriptions list. If it has not yet been enabled, then navigate to Company, Admin, then Subscriptions, and you can enable it here. If it has been enabled, just click Configure. If you can't find the taxes subscription here, then check the order entry and purchasing configuration screens. If the Use Advanced Tax Schedules tick box is selected on any of these, then deselect it and check the subscriptions page again. Our first choice is to decide whether we need to set up a system for use with multiple or single tax jurisdictions. Choose multiple tax jurisdictions if your company includes multiple entities that report into different tax authorities. As you can imagine, single tax jurisdiction just means that all of your entities will report into the same tax authority. As you can see from our example, we have our system set up to deal with multiple tax authorities. If it was set to single, then you would see the tax jurisdiction used for all of your entities listed on this screen. As a side note here, you can start with a single jurisdiction. Then, as your company grows, you can switch to multiple jurisdictions if required. Moving down this screen, we can see the option to turn off the government service validation of tax numbers. If this option is selected, the system won't then call the validation service used for the United Kingdom, European Union countries and Australia. Leaving it unticked will allow Sage Intacct to validate the VAT numbers against your company, entities, contacts, customers and suppliers to improve compliance. For this reason, it's best practice to leave this feature switched on. For this demonstration though, we will tick the box. You can also see the option to turn off tax detail filtering. This is a setting that controls which tax details you can see when creating customer and supplier invoices. To see how this works, we'll leave it switched on and we'll open a customer record. Here we can also cover off some other prerequisites. In the tax calculation section of the additional information tab, we have the option to state whether our transactions with this customer are taxable. Ticking this will make sure that when applicable transactions are created in accounts receivable for this customer, the user will select the appropriate tax detail to apply to each line item. When applicable transactions are created in order entry, however, the system will automatically calculate the VAT based on the tax group of this customer and the tax group of the item on the order. The groups listed here are groups of tax details. Depending on the system you've used previously, you may have referred to tax details as tax codes or perhaps VAT rates. If we select the UK customer group and then open the default tax schedule drop-down, we can see the tax details that have been added to this group. If we select UK sale goods standard rate here, then this will be used as the default tax detail for each entry on this customer's invoice. If we quickly look at the invoice screen for this customer, we can see that if we change the tax detail on the entry line, then we can only choose from the tax schedules that were included in the UK customer tax group. This is down to the tax detail filtering feature that we left switched on earlier. Had we switched it off, then all tax schedules in the system will be available to choose from. Because of this, best practice is to keep this feature switched on to help avoid user error and improve user processing time. The settings that we've seen here are mirrored in your supplier records, so those will also need to be set up prior to processing any transactions that include VAT. Going back to the original screen we started on, we can save this and move on to the next step. Navigate to Taxes, then select Tax Solutions within the Setup tab. Click Edit next to the desired tax solution. Enter the general ledger accounts that were created at the start of this process for input and output VAT. Input taxes are created when posting VATable transactions to your supplier accounts, whereas output taxes originate from your customer accounts. Over time, things may change with regard to the tax details required for processing. For example, the temporary hospitality reduced rate, which was brought in to help the hospitality industry during the COVID pandemic, which has recently been removed. As these changes occur, you can update Sage Intacct with the most recent tax details to ensure you maintain compliance. If we look at the Entities tab, we can see the entities which use this tax solution. The tax schedule maps show the tax schedules and which contact and item tax groups they belong to. The Tax Details tab shows us information on the tax details used in this tax solution. If you're using the order entry or purchasing applications, you also need to define items as taxable to ensure that the VAT elements of any associated transactions are captured and processed correctly. The way to do this is to tick the taxable tick box within the General tab of the item record. You also need to make sure that they are part of the correct item tax group. You need to create a document template to use for printed sales invoices. This template must be set up to include the VAT element of your invoice. Sage Intacct provides samples for you to build your own from if you'd wish to do so. Links are in the description to the step-by-step guide for creating document templates. You need to create at least one transaction definition for both the order entry and purchasing applications. Transaction definitions are templates for sales and purchasing transactions. They contain the information that determines the transaction's behaviour. So things like whether the transaction should include subtotals, which they absolutely should when dealing with VAT. Training is available within the Learning Centre on how to create and deal with transaction definitions, so we'll just focus on what's needed when dealing with VAT. The Enable Subtotals checkbox must be selected. One subtotals line must be configured for tax. Make sure that only one line in the transaction subtotals table is marked as is tax. If you have more than one line marked this way, then the VAT will get calculated twice. Likewise, if no lines are marked this way, then no VAT will be calculated for the transaction. The transaction must be posted to accounts receivable for sales invoices, accounts payable for purchase invoices, or the general ledger. Typically, you would post the general ledger through the accounts receivable or accounts payable application, so you would choose one of these here, although the option is here to choose the general ledger if you have different workflow requirements. For sales transactions, you need to make sure that you've selected the applicable document template from the printed document template drop-down list. That brings us to the end of the prerequisites. We now just need to finalise the setup. Before we do that though, here is a quick summary of the steps that we've gone through. We set up user permissions. We set the correct language for our region. We set the correct accounting method. Remember, accruals only is the only supported method here. We entered the VAT registration number and operating company at the top level. We configured our tax subscription. This was where we set things like whether we wanted a single or multiple tax jurisdiction. We configured our tax solution. Here we added the desired general ledger accounts to report on our input and output VAT, as well as the starting date for our first tax period. We ensured our customer and supplier records are defined with certain tax-specific attributes. Here, we declared whether our customers and supplier transactions were taxable. We defined our items as taxable and assigned them to the correct item contact tax group. We looked at creating and assigning printed document templates, and we looked at creating transaction definitions for both order entry and purchasing. So now we're ready to finalize our setup. If you're dealing with a multi-entity setup, you'll need to either submit a single return for all of the entities or submit separate returns for individual entities or groups of entities. If you need to create one VAT return for all of your entities including the top level, then make sure that the same VAT registration number and operating country is set for the top level and each entity. To do this, whilst in the top level, navigate to Company, Setup, then Company, and then click Edit. Select the correct operating country, enter the VAT number, and then click Save. Now navigate to Company, Setup, and Entities. Ensure the operating country and VAT number for each entity is the same as the one entered at the top level. When you submit a VAT return this way, you create the VAT return from the top level of the company. If you need to create separate VAT returns for each entity, then follow the steps mentioned previously. However, for each entity, specify its own VAT registration number and operating country. When submitting VAT returns for individual entities, you can create the return from the top level or from the entity. And as you've probably guessed, creating submissions for groups of entities that don't include the top level works in the same way. Just make sure that each entity within the group have the same VAT registration number and operating country. When your company is set up for submitting VAT in one or more groups, you create the VAT return from the top level of the company. You'll then be prompted to select which entity in the group is the reporting entity. The VAT return is then created using the business information for the contact in that reporting entity. And that brings us to the end of this overview. For more information on setting up the taxes application, please view the in-product help files for our step-by-step guides.